Hey everyone, welcome to the third session of the massive open online course, 13th semester for the University of Nicosia's master's degree in digital currencies. I'm your teacher for this week, Andreas Antonopoulos, and I'll be answering the questions you submitted on the forums over the past week. This has been a very busy session with a lot of very interesting questions. Let's get a quick sound check, make sure everybody can hear me okay. Let me know on the chat if you can hear me okay, and we'll get started in just a second. All right, our first question comes from Jim. Coinbase transaction was mentioned a couple of times in the notes. What is a Coinbase transaction? Is that the description of a transaction on the blockchain? Is it Coinbase the exchange? What is it? Great question, Jim. No, it's not Coinbase the exchange. The exchange have named themselves after a feature that existed in Bitcoin from the beginning, and that is the first transaction that is in every block and is required in every block. There must be at least one transaction in every block. The first transaction in the block is called the Coinbase transaction. And the Coinbase transaction is a special transaction in each block that is created by the miners when they construct their candidate block. The Coinbase transaction is where new Bitcoin is produced as part of the mining process. So the block reward, which is the amount of money that is generated with each block, plus all of the transaction fees. All of this is recorded in a special transaction, the first transaction of the block, called the Coinbase transaction. There are a few interesting things about this transaction. Unlike all other transactions in the blockchain, the Coinbase transaction that exists in each block has no inputs. What that means is it's not spending previously existing coins. So every transaction in the blockchain has inputs and outputs, and the inputs tell you where the money is coming from. The Coinbase transaction has no inputs because the money is coming from the new block. And the outputs are the payment to the miner. Now, the miners put that in there to themselves, and it should match the total of the fees that are in the block, plus the correct block subsidy or reward that is part of the mining issuance. Today, that's 12.5 Bitcoin. In a couple of months, we're going to have the halving, and then it's going to go down to 6.25 Bitcoin. So think of it as 12.5 Bitcoin plus some fees, and that's what's in the Coinbase transaction, and it's payable to the address of the mining pool or miner that is mining that block. They constructed, they put the Coinbase transaction in there, payable to themselves. So that's what the Coinbase transaction is. Some more questions about mining, obviously one of the more difficult topics in the system. Derek asks, I'm currently finding it difficult to understand what the miners do to solve the mining puzzle. Can you provide more details about it? In simple terms, Derek, what the miners are doing to solve the mining puzzle, to do the proof of work, is a hash. They use a hashing algorithm called SHA-256 to produce a hash. Now, what a hashing algorithm does is it takes data, any size data, and it produces a 256-bit number, which is like a summary or fingerprint of that data. Now, when you put data into a hashing function, you can't predict what the fingerprint will look like, and because 256 bits is an enormous number, it can produce effectively in an enormous range between 0 and 2 to the 256. So the hashing algorithm essentially mixes up all of the data that you give it and produces this rather unique 256-bit number, which is the fingerprint of the data you gave it. So what the miners are doing is they're putting the header of the block. They have a candidate block that they're trying to solve or prove with the proof of work, and they take the header, which is 80 bytes, from that candidate block. And what the header contains, it contains within it the Merkle root of the transactions. That's basically a summary of all of the transactions that are in the block, including the Coinbase transaction. It contains a timestamp. Very, very importantly, it contains the hash of the previous block, its parent, so you know how it's connected in the chain. And I mentioned a timestamp already, and all of that information is hashed together. Now there's a special number in there called the nonce, and that's selected randomly, and that's just to introduce some randomness into the exercise. So the miner selects a nonce, and they can just pick a random number and they put it into the block header, and then they hash that block header with a SHA-256 algorithm, and they produce a hash. Now if that hash has a certain number of zeros in the beginning, they win. They've effectively proved and solved the puzzle. But the chances that it's going to have a number of zeros in the beginning are pretty small. So out of all of the possible 256-bit numbers, only a very small number of possible solutions produce a number that has sufficient zeros in the beginning. And of course, the more zeros you're looking for, the more difficult it becomes to find that number. So what's the miner doing? What they're doing is they're putting in a nonce, they're hashing to produce the result, and then they're incrementing the nonce and hashing again, and incrementing the nonce and hashing again, and repeating that process until they find a solution, which they may not find. Depending on how many hashes they do, they may never find a solution because they might be hashing too slowly. One of the miners who's going to do quadrillions of hashes is going to be lucky enough to find a suitable hash, and they do so by introducing all of these different nonce numbers into the header. So they're basically trying to guess which nonce is going to produce a hash that is suitable for the solution. Annabelle asks, what are the requirements for a cryptocurrency to be considered a cryptocurrency? Is there a way of creating some sort of checklist to determine what a cryptocurrency is? There isn't really a canonical definition of a cryptocurrency, simply because cryptocurrency is a marketing term, and it has become a marketing term, meaning that any currency that is based in some form on cryptography, some form of cryptography, or uses cryptography in some way, might be called by some people a cryptocurrency. What does that tell you about how it works? It doesn't tell you much. So the fact that somebody calls something a cryptocurrency doesn't mean much unless you ask some follow-up questions. So the interesting things are, the checklist that you said is a series of follow-up questions you can ask to see if this is an interesting kind of cryptocurrency. And of course, that's highly subjective. What is interesting to you? What is interesting to me? I can tell you what my list is, and it's a list that I've tried to popularize. So what's interesting to me is a cryptocurrency that is truly open and truly decentralized, meaning that it differs from previous forms of currency that we have and various other closed and controlled blockchains and cryptocurrencies that have been built since, by being open and decentralized, so nobody has control of the system, but it works on a basis of rules and everyone can participate. So I have a series of questions as a checklist. The first question is it open? What does open mean? It means, can anyone access it? Can anyone participate in the network without authorization, without vetting? Pretty much, can any computer on the open internet simply connect to the network and be part of it and participate in the network? There are nuances to that, of course. Is it open to miners? If it has a mining algorithm, can anyone participate as a miner without authorization and vetting? Can anyone do a transaction without authorization, vetting, etc., etc.? So open. Is it borderless? Does it operate across the entire world without concern about national borders, geographic borders, and various artificial limits on its propagation? Can you access this system from anywhere in the world, anytime, anywhere, by anyone? So is it borderless? Is it neutral? Neutral meaning that the system does not discriminate transactions based on source, destination, value, or purpose. A transaction is propagated on the system regardless of who sent it, who they sent it to, which source and destination addresses are involved in the transaction, how much was sent, and what the purpose, which is outside of the system, what the purpose of that transaction is. So a neutral system will transmit transactions regardless of source, destination, value, or purpose. It simply propagates transactions just like a neutral internet forwards packets regardless of source IP, destination IP, or application that is being served by that particular IP packet. Is it immutable? When you record something on this blockchain or this cryptocurrency, can that transaction be reversed? And of course, this is not a yes or no answer. After a certain time, does it become immutable, and how strong is that immutability? So for example, in the case of Bitcoin, we can say with a fairly high degree of certainty after 6 confirmations, the data in that blockchain is immutable enough that you can put quite a significant amount of value into it. And you can think of immutability increasing over time. The more confirmations you have, the harder it is to reverse a transaction. So after 100 transactions, after 100 blocks or 100 confirmations, the Bitcoin blockchain is considered immutable enough that you can spend the Coinbase transaction, which is the mining reward. Maybe after a day, 144 blocks, it has a very high degree of immutability. After a month, the amount of energy and money required to reverse the Bitcoin blockchain is just staggering. So immutable, that's another important criterion. So, is it open, borderless, neutral, censorship resistant? Is it immutable? And you can add to that also, is it publicly verifiable? Meaning, can anyone verify the transactions that are happening? Can you audit it? Basically, is it transparent? And you can keep adding other criteria depending on the importance you give to these criteria, but I think those are the most important for me in order to determine whether a cryptocurrency is interesting in that it is encompassing some of the characteristics that we see in Bitcoin that really made it different from everything that came before. Now, that doesn't mean something that doesn't fulfill these criteria isn't a cryptocurrency. It just means that it's not interesting to me because it doesn't represent the principles and characteristics that made Bitcoin interesting by being different. So, for example, if it's a controlled closed system that only operates within one country, sure, maybe that's called a cryptocurrency by some people, and maybe it's interesting to them. To me, it's incremental innovation. To me, it's more like a database, and not particularly interesting in its technology, and certainly not very interesting in its political and social implications. The next question is about Bitcoin transactions as a unit of account. Willeen asks, I have heard you saying on your YouTube videos that you operate in the Bitcoin ecosystem, meaning that I earn Bitcoin from my work. So if you charge, for example, a certain amount of US dollars as a speaking fee for a conference, do you look to see what the value of Bitcoin is at that day to determine how much Bitcoin the organization should send? So this is an interesting question, and it really refers to whether we use Bitcoin as a unit of account. If you think about it from a perspective of economics, a system of money has 3 different characteristics that are dominant characteristics. It can be a unit, it can be a store of value, meaning that it retains its value over long periods of time and people use it to preserve wealth for the future. It can be a medium of exchange, meaning that you use it for transactions to exchange it against goods, products, services, etc. And it can be a unit of account. And a unit of account is when you count other things with that, where you use it as a measuring unit, effectively, for value. Now, there's a lot of argument about whether Bitcoin is and which of these three things it is. Is it a good store of value? Is it a good medium of exchange? Is it a good unit of account? And most of the argument is whether Bitcoin is a good store of value or a good medium of exchange, or both. But I think there's pretty broad agreement that Bitcoin is not a good unit of account. And the reason Bitcoin is not a good unit of account is because at its current size, its economy isn't big enough to give it the kind of stability that would make it a stable unit. As a result of volatility, its value increasing and decreasing from speculation, because it's such a small economy where even a small amount of speculation can move its market value, it's not a good unit of account. Let's compare it, for example, to the US dollar. Because the US dollar has an enormous economy behind it, even though it is used as a speculative asset, even though a lot of people are trading in foreign exchange markets dollars all the time. It takes moving trillions of dollars to change the value of the dollar on a day-to-day or minute-by-minute basis. It may change slowly, losing value over time as more dollars are printed through inflation, and it fluctuates on a day-to-day basis, but it fluctuates in a degree of thousandths of a penny or hundredths of a penny, not whole dollars. Whereas Bitcoin can go up and down by 10% in a day or 5% in a day, which is a very, very large fluctuation. So it doesn't make a very good unit of account. Now, in practice, what does this mean? When I use Bitcoin in my businesses, I use it both as a store of value and as a medium of exchange. I get paid in Bitcoin, and I provide services in return for payment in Bitcoin. And I may either pay my suppliers, my contractors, my employees in Bitcoin, or I may store that Bitcoin long term as an investment or savings account. However, I do not use Bitcoin as a unit of account because it isn't suitable. Also, for another reason, which is I have to do my accounting in US dollars in order to pay my taxes as a US citizen, and therefore I need to do my unit of account in the same unit as I have to do my tax accounting. So if I go to a conference and I say, I'm going to charge you and I need you to pay me in Bitcoin, I will tell them I'm going to charge you $100 to speak at your conference, and I need you to pay me in Bitcoin. I'm not going to say I need you to pay me 0.01 Bitcoin, because the value of that may change and it's going to make everything difficult from a tax accounting and payment perspective. So I'm going to quote my price in dollars. The same thing happens when I pay my employees. Their salary is quoted in dollars, even if I pay them in Bitcoin or pay part of their salary in Bitcoin. So how do we determine the value? Very simple. In all of the contracts, there is a section of the contract that says how the exchange rate is calculated. And I would have to do the same thing if I was getting paid in British pound sterling, in euros, in yen, etc. I would still quote a US dollar price, and then I would get paid in another currency with an exchange rate at the day of payment. So the exchange rate is specified so that the day that my customer pays me, they do a calculation based on a well-published rate. So you can use, for example, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Bitcoin reference rate for the day. That's a specific amount. It's once per day, and that payment rate for the day of the payment is a good exchange rate for Bitcoin for me. It doesn't really matter which one you pick. You could use bitcoinaverage.com. You could say I'm going to it based on the rate that Coinbase advertises, etc. You want to pick something that doesn't change too much. So maybe it's the average of the day rather than the spot price at the moment that they pay you. And that's basically how I do it. All right. Let me know if sound and video is good. In the meantime, let's go on to our next question. Mode asks, we have learned that it is hard but not impossible to guess a key, even though 1 billion days and 1 billion guesses would have to be used to try to do it. Actually, it's billion, billion, and billion, billion, but it's a very, very big number. If so, why are some platforms like exchanges hacked and have their Bitcoin stolen in the past? How is this possible technically? The way this is possible, Mod, is really simple. They're not guessing the keys. What they're doing is they're stealing the keys because those keys are stored on computers. So if you think of an exchange, one of the functions that an exchange has to do is it has to be able to do withdrawals of exchange funds when customers ask for a withdrawal. So if you go on an exchange and you say, I want to take out my Bitcoin, please send me my Bitcoin to this address, the exchange has to have a way to process that withdrawal. In order to process that withdrawal, they have to sign a Bitcoin transaction, which means they have to have the keys for that Bitcoin inside the server software ready to make a transaction. Now, theoretically, you could have that key material stored in a hardware wallet or cold storage, but then all that would mean is that some poor person would have to sit there and keep doing transactions. Now, if you can imagine an exchange that's doing thousands of transactions per day or thousands of withdrawals per day, this would quickly become impossible to do manually, so you'd have an automated system. And if you're not checking, then you might as well make it completely automated, because stolen Bitcoin would be signed just as easily as regular withdrawals. It's very difficult to check if what the server is telling you is true. Now imagine this server has the Bitcoin keys in its memory, in the software, and is able to use those to sign withdrawals. So if you're a hacker and you break into that computer and you take control of the operating system and you're able to read the data on the hard drive or in the memory, then what you can do is you can either read those keys and use them to sign transactions of your own, or you can simply instruct the server to withdraw the money to an address of your choice, and it will happily sign those transactions and withdraw the money. So the keys are not being guessed, they're being stolen. And the reason they're being stolen is because exchanges have to hold the keys they need to do withdrawals in a hot wallet. They have to hold them online on the software. And because exchanges concentrate the money of thousands and thousands of customers, their security has to be thousands and thousands of times better. And as you can imagine, that doesn't scale. At some point, it's safer to have thousands or hundreds of thousands of customers each store their own key because it's harder to hack all of them. But if they concentrate all of their money onto an exchange, and that exchange is holding the money of 100,000 customers and the keys of 100,000 customers, there is no computer security system that is 100,000 times better to make sure that that exchange doesn't get hacked, which is why you see these hacks happening. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are only secure when they are decentralized, meaning that each individual keeps control of their own keys and does not use a third party to hold on to their money as a representative. You should never use an exchange as a wallet. Or, to keep it more simple, the slogan that you need to remember is your keys, your coins. Not your keys, not your coins. If you've given up your keys to someone else, then effectively they're their coins. And let's hope they keep them safe for you. The follow-up question to that, Matthew asks, if you purchase Bitcoin using fiat or national money from an exchange, do you actually own Bitcoin? Can you withdraw it and send it or save it as you wish? If so, and you wish to withdraw your Bitcoin, what is the most secure way to store Bitcoin or any other crypto? So, to the point I just made, not your keys, not your coins, if you buy Bitcoin on an exchange and then you leave it on that exchange, that Bitcoin is not recorded on any blockchain as owned by you. It is recorded in a private database of a private company as owned by you, and if that database gets corrupted, if the money gets stolen, good luck getting it back. So effectively, you do not own Bitcoin at that point. You own a promise, or rather the exchange owes you Bitcoin, and that's a debt you may not be able to collect on. So can you withdraw it, spend it, or save it as you wish? Of course you can. And the way you do that is by asking the exchange to do a withdrawal to a Bitcoin address for which you control the keys. Meaning, you create your own Bitcoin wallet outside of the exchange, and you use one of the receive addresses, one of the Bitcoin addresses from the wallet that you control the keys. You put that into the exchange and you say, please withdraw my Bitcoin to this address. The exchange will then construct a transaction that pays that Bitcoin address, the amount of Bitcoin that you are owed, and then the Bitcoin will be in your control, controlled by your keys on your wallet. What is the most secure way to store Bitcoin or any other crypto? The most secure way and the best practice today is to store it using a hardware wallet. And a hardware wallet is a physical device, a hardware device that controls keys but also signs transactions and displays important security information on a secure screen usually. Hardware wallets such as the Trezor and Ledger, Cold Card, and others are available. You can buy them. Best to buy them directly from the supplier. The most secure way to store Bitcoin on a hardware wallet is to buy a hardware wallet, generate new keys, and when the keys are generated, you will be given a mnemonic phrase, which is your backup. That is the basis for your keys. That mnemonic phrase is 12 to 24 English words. You should write those down in sequence, numbered, so you know what the sequence is, and store at least 2 copies in 2 secure locations, perhaps a locked drawer, in your desk, in a fireproof safe, in your home, or a safe deposit box. Don't try to get fancy. Use the method and mechanisms suggested by the manufacturer. Do not cut up your keys into portions. Do not try to encrypt them. Do not try to hide them in different places. Make 2 complete copies of your entire mnemonic and store them in physically secure locations. You can also add to that a tamper-evident seal or bag so that you know if someone has taken a peek at your mnemonic phrase. If you need extra security because you don't have a secure location, you might want to add a passphrase to your mnemonic, but then you need to also back up your passphrase. And for extra resilience, you can also store your mnemonic phrase, your 12 to 24 English words, on a physical device made of steel that can withstand the temperatures of a type of fire that you might have in a house. So you can also buy various devices. Choose the ones that are made from steel because aluminum melts in house fire, and store your 12 to 24 English words on a steel device with a tamper-evident seal somewhere secure. And that's basically how you do it. And if you only have a small amount may be different from person to person. Let's say $10 or $100 worth of Bitcoin. It's probably not worth it to spend $100 worth of Bitcoin to buy a hardware wallet and do all of this work. You might do it therefore on your mobile device or smartphone, which might be a better storage location. But if you have thousands of dollars worth of Bitcoin, then it is worth spending $100 to secure that Bitcoin, and buying a hardware wallet is the best way to go about it. Jean asks, do you think that in the near future the current explosion of crypto will stop and then a few cryptocurrencies will remain, or that we will see a huge number of cryptocurrencies? And there's a couple of answers in the comments in the forum that you can look at. But here's the bottom line in my particular answer. I think we're going to continue to see a very large number of cryptocurrencies being built. Now, that doesn't mean they have any value, but because it's so easy to build a cryptocurrency, everyone will build a cryptocurrency. So there will be thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cryptocurrencies, tokens, and blockchains that will be built by people for different purposes and different reasons. Of those, probably only a few will be useful, broadly used, and valuable in an economic sense, a direct economic sense as a medium of exchange, and they will form what's known as a power law distribution, or also known as a Pareto distribution in a statistical sense. A power law distribution, or long tail distribution if you like, is one where you have a handful, 2, 3, 4, 5 winners that dominate the vast majority of use, number of users, economic value, etc. And then you have a very, very long tail of tiny alternatives that are still around and have some economic value or some use to some people, but not real dominance. So in a graph, it will look like the winners, which might be 1, 2, or 3 systems that have, say, 80% of the value, and then it drops, and then you have a very long tail that goes out into the thousands, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of tokens. Sagan adds a comment here. The point is that each country will create their own coin, but the country that has the economic and political power will emerge in the space. There will also be regulations, but I don't think Bitcoin will be the most adopted because of its price volatility. So only a stable coin will have utility. I actually disagree with that. I think the idea of central bank digital coins and nation-state digital coins, of course these will happen. Nations will create their own digital coins. But these do not compete directly against cryptocurrencies, and they don't compete directly against especially cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. And the reason they don't compete directly is because they do not solve the same problem. The point of a cryptocurrency that is open and decentralized like Bitcoin is that it allows anyone to participate regardless of borders. It is open, neutral, censorship resistant, immutable, borderless, and publicly verifiable. Any nation-state currency will be none of those things. Nation-state currencies cannot be open, they cannot be borderless, they cannot be neutral, they cannot be censorship resistant, they cannot be immutable, and they might be somewhat publicly verifiable. They're also not going to have a fixed monetary supply and digital scarcity as Bitcoin does, because governments like to print money. So they don't serve any of the same purpose as a cryptocurrency. I don't think that the real competition to cryptocurrencies is nation-state money, but we will see digital currencies from nation-states. We will also see digital currencies in the form of open, decentralized cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. Daniel asks, why is SHA-256 applied twice? The process of creating a Bitcoin address from a public key is explained in the course material. At the fourth step, SHA-256 is applied twice to the key material, the data. What does this double application of the hash function bring to the result? Wouldn't it be sufficient with a single hashing of the data? Yes, it would be sufficient to do a single hashing of the data. However, applying the hash twice significantly increases the security of the algorithm, because if you're trying to reverse a hash, doing it twice is significantly more difficult than doing it once. So you have to find 2 pre-image attacks in a row. And as a result, Satoshi chose to use a double hashing function not only in the transaction construction, but actually in many different places. When we say the data is hashed, for example, in the block header, it's hashed twice with SHA-256. When the transaction header is hashed, it's double hashed. Almost everywhere where SHA-256 is used, it's used twice. And that's because of additional security that's offered by doing it twice, which makes it more difficult to do a pre-image attack. Dan has a question here. Dan says, one to many or one to one? So we're looking at relationships here. So Dan says the relationship between an individual and a transaction goes like this. An individual, a wallet, an account, a private key, a public key, a Bitcoin address, and a transaction. Is this chain of relationships correct? Which of these relationships are one-to-many? Which ones are one-to-one, many-to-many, or many-to-one relationships? Where's the mnemonic phrase, and does that give me access to the wallet? Does a mnemonic phrase have a public-private key pair? How does this change with multisig? Lots of questions. Let's try to see if we can answer that. All right. First of all, the relationship between individuals and wallets is very, very unclear. It's primarily a many-to-many relationship. Many individuals can control many wallets, such that a single individual can have one wallet, a single individual can have many wallets, but also many individuals can control a single wallet jointly because they all have a copy of the key material. Now, a wallet itself is really just a software container for keys, so the term wallet means different things to different people. So instead of that, we're going to look at the relationship between keys and wallets. The most common standards we have for generating and storing and signing with keys is called a hierarchical deterministic wallet, or HD wallet. An HD wallet is a wallet where you have an initial seed which can be backed up as a mnemonic phrase, and that initial seed produces a series of keys which can be used for a variety of purposes. It's called hierarchical because the keys are not produced just in a sequence, but instead they're produced in a tree-like structure where you have a parent key that can have many children. Each of the children can have more children. Each of the children can have more children all the way down, and there's no limit to how many times you can go down the chain. Well, there is, but it's such a huge number that it doesn't really matter. So the path that you can use allows you to select from one parent, generate up to 4 billion distinct children, each of which can in itself generate 4 billion distinct children, each of which can generate 4 billion distinct children, etc., in a massive tree. That's a hierarchical deterministic wallet. Almost all of the wallets you're dealing with do that. In fact, what they do is they give special meaning to specific structures within the tree. So you have the initial parent seed, or the root seed, which is backed up through the mnemonic phrase of 12 to 24 English words. And that's why you can use those 12 to 24 English words to recreate the seed, recreate the root key, and from the root key all of its children, and their children, and their children, and their children. All of these children are effectively private keys. Now, some of those have special meaning, as I mentioned, and so, for example, you can say that the first child of the root key I'm going to use for Bitcoin. The second child I'm going to use for Ethereum. The third child I'm going to use for Litecoin. The fourth child I'm going to use for another currency. Well, now you have the ability to store multiple different cryptocurrencies in the same tree, hierarchical deterministic wallet generated from the same mnemonic phrase. And so you can have currencies as components of a single mnemonic phrase and seed key. But you can also then subdivide and say, underneath the Bitcoin child, I want to have account 1, account 2, account 3, and these are maybe for different accounting purposes. Maybe I'm going to put my company funds in account 1, I'm going to put my personal funds in account 2, I'm going to put a savings account in account 3, whatever you want to do. Now, from these you then are able to generate a private key. So a mnemonic phrase can generate a single seed which can generate billions of private keys. in a specific structure which has meaning, and each one of these billion private keys has one corresponding public key. So one private key produces one corresponding public key. So that's a one-to-one relationship. And each public key generates effectively one Bitcoin address. Now that's not exactly perfect. There are ways to generate different forms of Bitcoin addresses from the same public key, and that's because we have different encodings of Bitcoin addresses. But at a very basic level, because a Bitcoin address is the hashed public key, again, it's a one-to-one correspondence. So one private key generates one public key, which generates one Bitcoin address. And now we get to transactions. Transactions are many-to-many. Transactions aggregate inputs and outputs, meaning that you can have a single transaction that has inputs from one person and outputs from the same person. So that would be, for example, if I'm sending money from my own wallet to another one of my own wallets, or back to the same wallet, I can make a transaction from my wallet to my own wallet just to test something. It will work. It's going to cost me some fees. Or I can use a transaction to transfer money from one of my wallets to another one of my wallets, something I do very often, like to migrate to a new software that I like, or to move money from my savings to my current account, or to move money from my company account to my personal account, etc., etc. So a transaction may represent one person's money on both sides, or it could represent a financial relationship between two people, like a buyer and a seller. So the inputs come from the buyer, the outputs go to the seller, and that's a one-to-one relationship. It could also be a one-to-many relationship. So I could have a transaction where I send money to 3 different people. So the inputs come from me and the outputs go to 3 different people. So that's a one-to-many. But ultimately a transaction is an open many-to-many because you can construct a transaction where some of the inputs are spending your money and some of the other inputs are spending other people's money. So you can basically get together with, say, 100 other people, and you can construct one transaction that takes money from 100 accounts where you each sign the inputs that belong to you and sends money to 100 recipients. And that transaction is generally called a coin join. And it's a specific way to ensure privacy. But effectively, a transaction is a many-to-many relationship because the inputs and the outputs, it can have a very large number of inputs and a very large number of outputs, and they don't have to come or go to the same people, or the same accounts, or the same wallets. Marcus asks, and this is a question about mining, how do mining pool operators determine which starting nonce to give which participant of their pool? Since mining is a highly competitive work, if every participant in a pool started at nonce 1 and worked their way up, the strongest participant would really have all of the valuable computing on a single nonce and would beat everyone else. Exactly. So there must be some kind of system that lets pool operators give different starting nonces for every pool participant. All right, from a practical perspective, it matters not at all which nonce you start with, right? And it also doesn't matter how you change nonces. So let me give you an example. Let's say you were trying to find a very specific thing in a field. Let's say someone drops their smartphone in an open field and you've got 10 friends and you're trying to find the smartphone. Well, In that case, it matters where everybody's looking. You're going to need some coordination. And the reason is because while it's a big field, there's only one smartphone and only one person is going to find it. There aren't other smartphones in there. You only dropped one. So you may want to coordinate and say, okay, why don't you start at this row of the field, I'll start at this one, and go through in some kind of systematic and methodical way. Now think of it in a different way and say we've got 1,000 people standing on a beach, and what we're looking for is a fleck of sand that is a very specific color of blue. It's made of a specific type of rock, and it's this very specific color frequency of blue. And you have a machine and you just pick one grain of sand and you say, is this the one? No, that's brown. Is this the one? No, that's slightly reddish. Is this the one? It's blue, but not the exact speck of blue. Now, how many are there in the beach? There's probably thousands and thousands of specks of sand that are blue, but you might have to go through tens of thousands before you find them. So it doesn't really matter where you start on the beach. In fact, the easiest way to do it is for everybody to start just where they happen to be standing. Just look down, pick up some sand, and start looking for the ones that look blue. And that's really what nonce mining is like. The actual space we're looking at is enormous. 2 to the 256 is literally like looking at every grain of sand and every beach and every desert on the planet a billion times over. These are unfathomably large numbers, and you're going to have to sift through them. Now, within this massive beach, if you like, there are more than one solution. So the answer to the proof of work algorithm is actually more than one solution. In fact, it's a very, very large number of solutions. Let's say that out of the 256 bits, let's say the first 200 bits have to be zeros if the difficulty was very, very difficult, right? We're not there now, but let's say the first 200 bits of the hash that you produce have to all be zeros. That still means there's 56 bits worth of solutions. That means that there are 2 to the 56 possible proof of work solutions in that space that you could find, which again is an unfathomably large number. You're not looking for a needle in a haystack. You're looking for a billion needles in a quadrillion haystacks. And so where you start doesn't matter. Just start wherever you are. Now, you don't want everyone starting on the same part of the beach, because then it's about who gets the most grains of sand per second. If they start with the exact same cup of sand, that's going to be a problem. So you don't want everybody to start with nonce 1. Well, in computer science, we always count from 0, so everyone would start with nonce 0. And that wouldn't help, right? Then they're all competing for the exact same solution, the first one that they find starting from 0. Another idea would be, why not just pick a random nonce and then keep picking a random nonce? So start at 3, and then go look at 15, and then go look at 6, and then go look at 173, and then go look at 1, and then go look at 297, and just keep jumping randomly around the nonce space. The reason is really simple. It's very inefficient to run a random number generator compared to simply adding 1. So once you've picked a starting point, it's better to simply add 1 and look at nonces sequentially. So all of the miners are going to be doing incremental searches. They're just going to add 1 to the nonce that they start with. But where they start needs to be relatively free space where nobody else is looking. Well, here's an idea. The nonce itself is 32 bits. There's another 32 bits of extra nonce, and you can find other ways to tweak the amount of search space that you're looking at, which means that these are, again, staggeringly large numbers. We're looking at a space of somewhere between 64 and 100 bits of search space for the nonce, which again, 2 to the 64, 2 to the 100 is an enormous number. So how do you pick your starting nonce? The easiest way to do it is randomly. If the mining pool operator gives a random starting nonce to each pool participant, we're good. They can from there simply add 1 to the nonce that they started with, and they're going to be looking at essentially virgin territory. They're going to be looking at a space that nobody else is looking at that time, even if you have thousands of pool operators looking at millions and millions of nonces. To make it easier, if you're a pool operator, maybe you don't give them a random number. Maybe what you do is you give them a pseudo-random or a deterministically random number to start with. And what that means is you could take their IP address plus some other information from as a starting point. Maybe since each pool participant already gives you a Bitcoin address where they want to be paid out, maybe you just hash that, and that's their starting nonce. That guarantees is going to be different because each one of them is going to have a different payout Bitcoin address. And just by hashing it once, you've got a random number. That's a great starting place for nonce. You could just give them that. In fact, they could just pick that as their starting place without any central coordination. So if you simply used a random number you already have, which is effectively how your Bitcoin address was created, as a pool participant, you could use that as your starting nonce, and nobody else is going to start at exactly that point. As long as everybody follows that rule, you don't even need any coordination. You basically start looking, again, with the example of looking for a specific grain of sand on the beach, you start where you're standing. And as long as where you're standing was random, that could be the Bitcoin address that you want to be paid out as, start there, and then increment by 1 and keep looking. Alexandros asks, what is your opinion of the problem of selfish mining? Are the concerns raised in the paper, majority is not enough, Bitcoin is vulnerable, valid? Is the proposed solution already implemented in the Bitcoin protocol? So the paper that Alexandros is referring to is a paper written by Ite Ayal and Emin Gunsira, and it was written in 2013, the issue of selfish mining. Since then, actually, a number of other types of attacks against mining have been found, and a number of solutions have been proposed. This is a research in from Cornell University. All right, so are the concerns raised in that paper valid? From an academic perspective, certainly they are valid. In practice, no one has attempted such an attack on any system that is strong enough to resist attack. So in the case of Bitcoin, we do not see these kinds of consensus attacks because the risk of launching an attack like this is enormous. So the amount of money it takes to launch an attack like this is extremely high. And the benefits of launching an attack like this, unless your only goal is to destroy Bitcoin temporarily, are very, very low. So the ability to double spend, for example, isn't a very big prize that would motivate someone to risk hundreds of millions of dollars in order to attack the consensus algorithm to get a brief advantage for a couple of hours in order to do a double spend attack. You'll be able to steal some money from exchanges, which will then modify their algorithm to require more confirmations to prevent such attacks in the future. It won't actually result in a very big payout. In terms of government attacks that might use these types of mining attacks to discredit Bitcoin, of course, there's a different type of risk. And the risk there is that it doesn't work. Because as bad as an attack to discredit Bitcoin is, even worse is an attack to discredit Bitcoin that then fails. Imagine if you attack Bitcoin and you manage to take it down for an hour and then it comes back. And you've just proven that a government spending hundreds of millions of dollars can only disrupt Bitcoin for an hour or a day, and then the system comes back. Well, you've actually ended up proving that it's more resilient than people think, which has already happened. People have attacked Bitcoin with a variety of mining based attacks, including some that have resulted in forks, attempts to double spends, there have been bugs, all kinds of things like that. And all of these attacks ended up proving that Bitcoin was more resilient than people thought. So there's a risk that if you try to do an attack like this, even if your goal is just to destroy or disrupt Bitcoin, the disruption isn't enough, and you end up proving that it's more resilient, which of course makes Bitcoin stronger. So there's a reason why we don't see these kinds of attacks. All right, let's one final economic concept here, maybe our last question for the day. Gek asks, suppose we have 100 billion US dollars in capital for Bitcoin, and let's say the number of Bitcoin in circulation is 10 million Bitcoin. How does an injection of 100 billion US dollars to buy Bitcoin get translated? Does that mean you add another 10 million Bitcoin to the supply? No. That is the fundamental economic concept behind limited supply. The supply of Bitcoin is inelastic. Now, what does that mean in economic terms? It means that if you create motivation for people to create more Bitcoin, it doesn't change how much Bitcoin people can create. Let's take another example of something that has elastic supply. Maybe not very elastic, but somewhat elastic supply. Let's say corn. You have a specific price of corn, and as a result, some farmers decide to plant corn this year and produce corn. Now, let's say by some insane calculation of economic interference, you decide that you're going to force people to put corn-based ethanol inside gasoline so that you can create a new market for corn, because that would be insane. Now, let's say that you pass that, and as a result, the price for corn increases. Because now you have more people trying to buy corn in order to turn it into gasoline, as well as the other things that can be used, that corn can be used for. So what happens? Well, because the supply is elastic, what happens is people will increase the supply because there's a higher price to be earned, which means more farmers will grow more corn until 1/3 of the surface of the United States is used to produce corn, so we can both poison the environment and poison our children with sugar. But that's an elastic commodity. Now let's say that your another elastic commodity would be oil or even gold. If the price of oil or the price of gold goes up, people start digging for oil in places where it was not economical to dig for oil before. They go 100 miles offshore and try to dig in the bottom of the sea. Now that's much more expensive than just making a hole in the ground in Texas. But if oil is expensive enough, it's worth doing. So the more the price increases, the more capital you put into a market, the more incentives there are to go out and increase the supply. That happens with oil, it happens with gold, it happens with pretty much any commodity. Now imagine if there was a commodity that no matter how high the price went, you could not make more of it. No matter how motivated you are, you cannot make more of it. That type of commodity, that kind of commodity would then be inelastic, infinitely inelastic. It has no elasticity whatsoever. The price cannot affect the amount that is produced. If you put an enormous amount of money into buying Bitcoin, you're going to drive the price up. But if that motivates more miners to mine more, all that does is it increases the difficulty of mining, but it doesn't produce more Bitcoin. The amount of Bitcoin that is produced every 10 minutes is fixed. So when more miners are encouraged by more price to mine more, what they do is they increase the difficulty of mining. They don't increase the supply of Bitcoin. So as in an inelastic system, what that does is it drives up the price. If you dump 100 billion US dollars on top of an existing 100 billion US dollars, so you double the amount of capital you put into Bitcoin, and there's still only, let's say, 10 million Bitcoin out there, each one of those 10 million Bitcoin now has to represent a twice as large economy or twice as large amount of value that you've put in, which means that its price doubles. That's it. The price changes, the unit remains the same, the supply remains the same. So large injections of capital into the Bitcoin market, and at the same time large withdrawals of capital from the Bitcoin market, cannot change the supply. They can only change the price. And with that, I think we've covered most of the questions that we had for this session. This has been session 3 of the 13th semester of the massive open online course for the University of Nicosia's master's degree in digital currencies. I'm your teacher, Andreas M. Antonopoulos. It's been a pleasure answering your questions. Please keep asking great questions. Post them on the forums, have conversations amongst yourselves, do your homework, and come back next week for one more session of this course. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend. Good studies. Bye-bye.